Hello and welcome to Gaming the Podcast. My name is John Robertson. I'm joined by Stace Harmon, and together we are Indie by Design. This week we're talking about Metal Gear Solid 1, and specifically we're talking about the opening hour from that game, from the moment that Snake first emerges from the water up to and including the Revolver Ocelot boss fight. We're talking about what makes it so special, what makes the opening memorable, what makes it worthy of replaying and appreciating, and talking about it on a podcast. Now, a few months ago, we did a podcast that focuses on Hideo Kojima himself, the designer of Metal Gear Solid, so do go back and check that out if you haven't already. And if you're watching on YouTube, then you will see a handy little link to that episode in the video right now. It's also worth mentioning that we'll be coming back to talk about Metal Gear Solid again in a few weeks when Metal Gear Solid 2 celebrates its 20th anniversary, so follow and subscribe to catch that episode as well. But for now, for this episode, we're all about Metal Gear Solid 1, so probably makes sense, seeing as we're talking about the opening hour, to talk about the opening minutes from, that moment where Snake comes in through the waterways, comes up into the little storage area before getting up the lift to go into the Shadow Moses facility properly. Stace, we've both played it recently. What was it like playing those opening minutes again?
I mean, it's just ridiculously good, isn't it? I mean, I remembered that it was good. I originally played it back in 98 when it was released and replayed it recently. It's amazing how well it stands up. It is an incredible introduction to a game and to a story. But I think specifically for me to a game, the fact that it's an introduction to a game is an important part here. Obviously, I'm not stating any groundbreaking news there, but to think about how it introduces the concepts, how it introduces the language of the game, and how you're going to be interacting with this thing for the next however many hours, 10, 12, however long it takes you. It does it in an incredibly intriguing way, but engaging way. Like you're set up as being Snake Solid. He's Solid Snake rather. He's
Snake Solid.
He's Snake Solid. He's quite a grounded dude. There is some stuff that we'll talk about later about his interactions with other people, but he's very much this effortlessly cool kind of super secret agent, and he's quite self-deprecating in certain places, but that little tiny opening where you emerge out of the water and there's two guards on a patrol route and you're learning how you're going to be playing this game does more, I think, in a more concise way than a lot of, I think, more modern games do in their first sort of 2 or 3 hours. It's an incredibly well curated little introduction to the character, to the story, to the stakes. It sets the stakes very high, very early. And I was thinking that it feels like what would in some games be sort of the ramp up towards the climax of the game, here is the introduction to the game. It's there's you're assaulting this base not because you've spent 10, 15 hours sort of learning how to be Snake Solid, and then going and sort of storm the base. It's this is right from the off. This is what you're doing, and I think that is it. Yeah, it's just like a no nonsense introduction. It gets to it straight away, and that's I think particularly appreciate that after playing perhaps some more what feel like bloated games by comparison.
Yeah.
It's cool. It's a great introduction to the story, to the character, to the mechanics. It's just, it's like an awesome introduction to a game. It's kind of how to do an introduction to a game as far as I'm concerned.
That sort of it doesn't sort of, in quotes, waste any time getting you to the meat, not only mechanically and you have to avoid these two guards to get up into the lift, and in order to do that you need to use stealth to do that. You can't just sort of go gung-ho and
but you don't even have any weapons, right? Initially you don't actually have a weapon. It's all on-site procurement, or OSP as they say in the voiceover. I like the little colloquial contractions and the COA, initializations.
The course of action.
Exactly. Some of which are unnecessary like that.
Yeah, no, it's even in the subtitles it even says COA brackets course of action. So all right. Thank you, because I would not have understood that. But yeah, the fact that you don't have a gun, and so it does really interesting. It kind of forces you or encourages you and teaches you that it's a stealth game immediately, which you kind of know already because it says like it's in the title, tactical espionage action. Like, so espionage is the E, but you don't have a gun, so you can't just take on these guards. You have to avoid them, and the fact that they've got vision cones, which is so mechanical, but it's telling you avoid. So the game is about avoiding stuff immediately through its visual presentation in how that radar works. And it also does an interesting thing when you approach the lift, and then the colonel comes onto the codec, and he says about he gives you some more exposition, and then he says, now go find somewhere to hide until the lift comes down. And so you go find somewhere to hide. Probably most people, I imagine I did. If you're watching the YouTube video now, you'll see me playing it. I hid behind the forklift truck thing.
Yeah. They even put a little pickup there. I think there's a ration there. Yeah. They even put a little pickup there as a little, like, you can stand over here. Yeah. Although you can't just stand there, can you? I think you do still have to move, because the guy, depending on the patrol route, depending on how quickly you've done that, he will sort of come up one side and then go around the other, and you have to kind of move. You don't just stand there literally doing nothing, waiting for the lift.
Yeah, although I think I did just stand there doing nothing. So I think you can. Although he did come and look, but he looks like just directly at the forklift and not through it.
Top guarding there.
But the lift takes a long time to come down.
It does.
So it's teaching you that this is a game of patience, and it's a game where it's not just about getting from A to B as quickly as possible. Like, it's not only a stealth game, like get here to here as quickly as possible. It's you'll need to wait. You'll need to overcome these guards over a period of time. Like, it's not a race. It's not a race to be stealthy. It's not a race to be invisible. It's constant awareness and constant reaction to what the enemies are doing. Okay, the patterns that the guards use are very predictable, and the vision cones mean that you've always got the upper hand against them, because you know exactly what they can and can't see. But that, I think one of the strengths of it is that even though it's so mechanical like that, it never feels anything less than tense. Like, it never takes away from the drama. It never takes away from the feeling that you are this guy who's alone. And I think that's another important thing as well in this very opening sort of little area. You're alone. Like, you've come from underwater. It's like the most alien environment for a human to be. You come up, you talk to someone who's God knows how far away on the codec. You very quickly know, or come to learn, that even the people on the other end of the phone don't know really what's going on.
And they tell you up front that you're alone. It's like, there's no backup. This isn't, you are officially, you're not here. Officially, you don't exist, etc. So there's no, don't expect, an airdrop of supplies in, 10 minutes. That's not happening.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, you've got all of these, and this is in the first 3 or 4 minutes of the game. You're given so much on that narrative level, on the mechanics level, on the being upfront with you about what kind of emotions and what kind of pacing, like what kind of emotions you're going to be feeling and what kind of pacing you're going to have to adapt to and take advantage of ultimately in order to get through whatever situations are going to come. So even though that sequence is so basic, it's just a little square room with square blocks placed around and 2 guards moving around it, and then all you've got to do is get to one point, hide, wait, get into the lift. It's so dense. It's so full of communication on all different levels. It's just so it's so cleverly designed in a way, and it pumps information in. Okay, some of the codec sequences are quite long. Certainly for a game at that time as well. Like, taking you out the action for that length of time was kind of unheard of, really.
I do, but I think that does fit into the patience thing as well. And I did feel at the time, and I think having replayed it recently, I still felt that they serve often as, like, narrative as reward. You do a lot of sneaking around. There is that tension. They serve as like the quiet kind of troughs in the peaks and troughs cycle, where it's like, okay, now I get to kind of chill out. I get to relax and listen. And yet, I mean, sure, they can go on a bit, and they are also somewhat on the nose, but I think retrospectively, that's part of the charm. Like, it's what elsewhere might be kind of like cliche and hammy. It is that, but in an endearing way, because it's so good at everything else. So it's like, I don't mind that. I know that that's kind of how it works with these games 20 odd years on. So yeah, the codec stuff, I think what I like particularly, although yes, it can be exposition heavy, they're teaching you how to play the game. And I like what they've chosen to do. There's some very overly complex, like convoluted explanations, narrative explanations for in-game mechanics that I love. I just think it's great. It's like even the way they talk about, they talk about like recording your data, or this is a dedicated channel for recording your data, i.e. saving your game, codec channel, or this is a like here's how key cards work. So you approach the door and it uses your body's own electrical field to transmit via your body salts a signal to the door to open the door. It's like, it's ludicrous, but it's awesome. But I love it. It's a very complicated way of saying you approach the door and the door will open. So okay, got it, cool. But I like that they address that in game, and there's like there's a narrative reason for how and why that stuff works, all the way down to him taking his cigarettes with him and being able to use that later on to see like infrared beams and stuff. So I always felt that. I always felt like it was almost a little reward. And it was, I think the pacing of it is such that you don't always know when that's going to happen. I think there's a bit where you're crawling through a vent very early on and you get a codec call, and it's like, that wouldn't necessarily be where you would put that. They would normally be more... That's a
McDonald Miller.
Follow
the mice.
Yeah, that's... we won't
spoiler that.
But,
but... Yeah, I remember, did you ever play, I think we might have mentioned this on the Kojima episode, I can't remember, so we'll just keep it short. But an opening of a game is really good when, on the old PS1 demo discs, I had the Metal Gear Solid demo, and I believe it ends as you go into the air vent. So you've got the opening sequence that we just spoke about, you come up in the water and you go up in the lift, and then you're in Shadow Moses properly, you see liquids fly off in the Hind D helicopter, and they're like, a Russian Hind D, what is that doing here?
What's that doing?
And then you go through the vent, either the one high up or the one low down. And then I believe the demo ends there. I think it does. But anyway, it's a really short demo. But I remember playing that with friends like 100 times.
Again. Yeah.
Like not
absolutely.
wanting to play other whole full games that we had, just like play that Metal Gear demo again. So games, and obviously at that age, I wasn't really thinking about it how I'm thinking about it now. Didn't really know mechanically or what it was sort of emotionally putting me in one way or the other as to why it was so good. But the game's got something when someone chooses to play the demo disc. And okay, you could say I was younger, I didn't have all the money to spend on games that I do now, so I was limited on choice. But still, there were other options, and that was the choice. So that's that opening that you'd already played 49 times. Oh, I'm going to play it for the 50th time today. Yeah.
And I did do the same. I did that a lot. And I think, Metal Gear 2 we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, but that was a similar thing with that. I remember showing people the introduction, and this was a bit different because it was just like the opening cutscene and the music, which was just phenomenal. And I remember putting that on to show people, be like, oh, you have to see this thing. And it was, same with the demo for Metal Gear Solid 1. And I was looking at the other games that came out around that, and there was a couple of years period where there was, you had things like Metal Gear Solid, and you had Half-Life, and you had Resident Evil, and Tomb Raider, and Soul Reaver, and a bunch of other stuff, Final Fantasy VII. I mean, it was, and a lot of those games have got incredible intros as well. So it was I don't know, it feels like it was more of the time. Like I would, off the top of my head, I would struggle to think of a game more recently that has really grabbed me. Like there's games that have gone the other way. The intro to Cyberpunk, I was not in. Like you can compare and contrast those things. It's like this puts you in a virtual shooting range to teach you how to use a gun in Cyberpunk. Metal Gear just puts you in the thick of it and tells you to get on with it. And also that it's worth just to jump back to that little opening bit with that square room. I also like how that it's a bit like a holding pen, and as you say, you have to wait a certain amount of time for the lift, so you have to wait for the game. The game doesn't necessarily just act on your input. But you are given the ability to make mistakes in that area and it not be devastating. It's like there's room enough and obstacles enough. It's a very strangely laid out room in real world terms, but who cares about that? To then run and hide again, or even if you die, you haven't lost progress because you've been stood waiting for something. So if you do get killed, it's like, well, okay, you just restart and you do it again. There isn't like, oh, I've got to now go back 15 minutes and reload my checkpoint or whatever. So I think it's doing multiple things. The opening area is doing multiple things without you even realizing that it is.
Yeah.
And then going through it and going, you see the base and then going through those vents. That I was struck by that as well. You go through those vents what feels like a long time. I think for longer than you would be allowed to now, or than would sort of be put upon you. It would be more like immediate. And this is
almost like a fast travel to like section 2.
Yeah. And this is a conveying part of that for me, is like a conveying how vast this complex is that you've entered into, and setting up that it's just little old you, tiny little Solid Snake, and you're going into this fortress that is huge and is very well armed. And, it's like that is again, it's just setting up that kind of David and Goliath dynamic, which I think works really well as well. Yeah,
it's interesting that, what you say about that opening room being small, and that gives you a chance to make mistakes because you're not punished through time if you have to restart it. Like the opening bits of the game are very modular, actually, when you think about it. There's that opening bit on the elevator, there's the next bit on the helicopter sequencing, and then you're introduced to the idea of cameras at that point. And then you go through the vent, and then you're in that room with the tanks, and then you go and see Meryl and etc. It's very modular, very like boom, 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 very mini levels until the game opens up a bit later. But we're not allowed to talk about that because we're only doing 1 hour, first hour. Very modular until all the way through you get to the boss fight. Now here's the boss fight module, the Ocelot module. It's all placed in, and then you start backtracking, going backwards and forwards through the base a bit later. But it's very interesting. The modular thing as well, this is not the smoothest segue in the world, but it reminds, when I was doing some research for this, I was looking at like making of videos and reading some stuff. And the modular element kind of feeds into the visual design, like how the camera work is designed. In that, so like some of those other games you mentioned, like Final Fantasy, like Resident Evil, it uses fixed camera positions. And Metal Gear Solid, for a lot of the time, is kind of a 2D game. Like it's a top-down game. Yeah. For a lot of its running time, it's top-down. And then in certain sequences where it makes sense in terms of the camera angle, the fixed camera position changes to another point, like an isometric point or behind you or in front of you, or whatever. And in some instances, you can't actually see everything in the room at that point. So like you can't see like items that be hidden behind stuff or whatever until you nudge up against the wall and then the camera changes or that sort of stuff. But Resident Evil and Final Fantasy use those fixed camera positions, but Metal Gear Solid takes it a step further in that it uses the fixed camera positions. But if you put Snake's back against the wall, then I use that as like a way of seeing, right? So you can see into the level in a different way, so you know what's coming up. I always hated using the first person. I always felt so vulnerable just standing there, pressing triangle and looking in first person and looking around. It's like, oh, there's a guard right there, 2 meters away. Oh my god, run! But the way that they did that, it's not apparently, it is, there's video of them doing it. The way that they chose how to use their camera angles was, and this is the modular link, they made Lego models of the areas, and they got a mini camera and would like use the mini camera and just move the camera angles around to see what looked good in the little Lego models that they made. So I think that's quite interesting from sort of like a historical perspective, that Kojima was wanting to do it that way so that he could see all the time how his fixed camera would impact the player's sort of like emotional reading and information gathering skills, but also how the player could interact and interrupt, I suppose, his director's eye on it. That kind of one-to-one, I want to know every single thing. That's much more like a filmmaker. That's much more how a filmmaker would go about seeing it and want to be in total control of every piece of visual information that the player is being given to at any one point. And even when the player decides, okay, I want to now nudge up against this and see a different angle, well, he's like, okay, fine, you can do that, but I'll decide what that angle is. Unless you go into first person, which completely changes that. But that first person mode, it almost makes me believe like he made it bad on purpose because he didn't want you to use it. It was just
I always used
bad.
it as a glancing, like I can kind of see my surrounding area. I'm looking at the radar thing, and then it was just like a quick switch to first person to
see what was the end of the
it was like to confirm what I think is already going on, right? Like, and then I would come out of it quite quickly. It was I'd never spent much time in it either, and it does put you into it when you like crawl under something, doesn't it? If you crawl under a vehicle or something, it puts you into it.
Or in the air vent, obviously, as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
they're almost like unique separate sections or unique visual moments that are separate from the game. You know what I mean? Of course they're not, but the actual...
Well, it raises the tension going through under a vehicle in particular, or under crates or whatever it might be, under like racks or something. Then you can see what Snake would see, and you don't get the benefit of the zoomed out perspective.
It's almost like a horror game at that point.
Yeah, it's like the unknown is out there, and I'm kind of safe in here. But at some point, I've got to stick my head out and risk it being, bitten off by the proverbial monster. And so, the top down to just go back to the camera for a moment, the top-down camera particularly, I always felt that was like it always fit for me. Like the tactical element of tactical espionage action was like, that is how you play, like, perhaps like an RTS or something. Like, that's how you play tactical games, is from that kind of tactical top-down view of what you're looking at. And I always felt that was, again, like another tie to the narrative of somehow you're Snake, but you're also like the people that have deployed Snake, and you're using him as a resource. You're moving him around this map, and it's like he is a piece on a game board kind of thing. And that, that again ties into the narrative that happens later on, which we won't spoil too much. But and it's also clear from the stuff that perhaps we can talk about, the interactions he has with some of those people on Codec. As you mentioned, it's evident that they don't know everything that's going on, but it's also evident that he either doesn't entirely trust them, or he isn't surprised if they are holding something back. Because he alludes to that a couple of times, like, are you lying to me, or what are you not telling me? He understands kind of his place in the game and knows that there's probably more at stake or more at play here than he's being told. So that kind of deploying him into the field and moving him around as an expendable resource, I think kind of I liked that, the way that fit for me, the way it felt to be doing that and be sort of complicit in that.
Yeah, and I think that expendability element and him being alone and vulnerable, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, but I guess that the 2D top-down perspective, it exacerbates that, because you're looking at him, you're looking down upon him. So that's always like, he feels vulnerable. He doesn't seem overly powerful. That would be like low angle, like would make him feel like the superhero angle.
It's almost dehumanizing, kind of like it's
so you're almost like looking at this poor guy who's almost in like a sort of test chamber. Of course he's not a poor guy, like he's really tough and he saves the day eventually and whatever, but that is a way of just instantly making you feel like you're in charge of someone who is fragile. Like he's not a superhero, even though he kind of is. But he's not a superhero in the same way as like Marcus Phoenix or Master Chief or whatever, who are always or would never be presented like that. Like that would be like, no absolutely. Way are we having Marcus Phoenix on that angle.
Well, and that, that actually ties into something I happened to notice that I wasn't going to mention, because it's unremarkable in and of itself, except I'm now going to remark on it because it ties into that very much. That I like that when you come up into that first room, he sits there and you see him, you don't see it entirely, but you see him start to take off his flippers, right? And I was thinking along those exact lines, it's like, you wouldn't see many other video game characters do that. That's like, there's an attention to detail there of, he is a person, he's got here in some way, and that's spoken about in the intro, that you're going to have to swim from a certain point onwards. And he sits there on the dock and takes off his flippers. And that's quite it's not that it's like unempowering. Yeah, it is humanized. It's not that it's like unempowering or disempowering. It's just that it is It's like, oh, he is just a man, or is how he's presented. Because you wouldn't see Marcus Phoenix taking off a pair of flippers,
come on.
Example.
Marcus Phoenix would never need flippers. He swims as fast as a dolphin. Yeah, exactly.
Run along the bottom of the ocean bed.
Yeah, he's just Sonic it along the bottom of the ocean, like destroying all coral in his wake. Just this incredible environmental disaster as this tank of a man runs along.
It's just collateral damage.
Yeah,
got to do what I got to do. So. Yes, so it is. Yeah, so there is a nice little touch there of that humanizing, and another element I think that does that, as thirsty as some of these characters are when they're talking to each other, and it's a bit of an odd thing, and it's a bit of a roll your eyes when they're talking to each other about strip searches and other stuff. It's also, there is a moment that I like when I think it's Meryl, after you've met her for the first time, she then contacts you on Codec, and she says, "Oh, it's the living legend. I can't wait to meet you, or I can't wait to, see you again, or whatever it is. It's like, I didn't think I'd ever meet the living legend that is Snake." And he says, "Well, yeah, I think actually you'll get over that when you meet me in person, because I can't possibly the man can't live up to the legend," which I think is quite it's a very oft used sentiment. But for him to use it about himself, and for him to be aware of his own legend and be like, yeah, don't get too excited. And I was comparing that to somebody like the films of the time. So like, say the James Bond films is probably an obvious touching point. Around that time, it was like the time of GoldenEye, when Pierce Brosnan would never have been self-deprecating in that way. That character that he embodied as James Bond was like, it would have been more, oh, was I everything that you dreamed I would be kind of thing. Whereas in this instance, he's very like, no, that's just all bluff and bluster. And that's for other people to decide what I am and how they view me. I'm just a guy doing a job kind of thing. And I liked that. That was quite a grounded way of talking about himself as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because at the time, I remember, this is when I was like, consuming every single word in multiple games magazines every single month that they were released. And a lot of reviews for Metal Gear Solid and a lot of the commentary around Metal Gear Solid would compare it to things like James Bond directly and say like, oh, this is a spy thriller in the vein of James Bond. But beyond the fact that there's like a secret base with a sort of maniacal bad guy, it's not really. Like, no, Snake was nothing like any of the James Bonds. Maybe like the Timothy Dalton one was like the closest one, but like still no, not really. Like it was nothing. And the emotion around the film, the sense of the feelings that it generates in you, yeah, you're right. Like it's nothing like James Bond. Like you couldn't imagine Snake being happy going to like a fancy like gown ballroom events with chandeliers and canapes and and sort of fitting in there and sort of taking
a favourite cocktail. No, I don't.
Like, no chance. So I go. Like, it's kind of. I mean, when I was younger, I just sort of took that as like, oh yeah, okay, I get it. But I get the comparison. But going certainly, because I played through this last year as well. I played through this whole thing last year. That ages the podcast, in 2020. And then played it for this. So I've, and since playing it as someone who's older, I just don't, I don't want to sort of bang on about the games press. Like we were both members of it for a long time, but, like that's just such a pointless comparison.
It is. It's a little bit of a lazy comparison. I think it's easy to, I guess it's a one man army, although that's referenced as well in the game as well. But it's an easy touching point, but not a particularly accurate one or useful one. And I think it does a bit of a disservice to Snake and to the writing of Snake. I think
another thing as well, and this is again terrible segue, but it's something about it is that so emotional side of it still. The game's really unique visually, and one of the things I think is quite interesting is that it uses in-engine graphics for the cutscenes, which is, other games at the time, Resident Evil didn't do that, Final Fantasy VII didn't do that.
Tomb Raider didn't do that.
And then this uses in-game graphics, and obviously the graphics are not as good, but the as CGI or in a traditional way of determining value, they're not as good, but for this, I think they're way better than if it would be CGI. Of course, it's hard to imagine it without it at this point, but it makes, by comparison, it makes the gameplay bit seem more important and more connected, because you're not waiting, or you're not switching backwards and forwards between like, oh, here's actually what these characters really look like, guys. Like, this is the important bit. This is the story. This is what they really, this is how they really move, and this is how they really look, and whatever. And these are their real facial expressions. No, they don't do any of that. They just use the same basic character models, and they're confident enough to have like the camera panning into close-ups to their faces that are just like pixelated, kind of in, you know, like barely
eyes.
human.
It looks like everybody's got their eyes closed.
Yeah. But I think, and this was something that was like really, really came out playing it in advance of this for me. It's something that really shone. Was like, that does create more connection to the game as a game than it would if those cutscenes were, you know, what Metal Gear went on to be with all the fancy cutscenes and stuff. Yeah. But I thought
it would always be. I think it's always slightly jarring, even almost imperceptibly so. But it's slightly jarring when you do have cutscenes, and I understand why. You know, particularly of the time, like Tomb Raider did it using like CG cutscenes that look amazing, or at the time looked amazing, you know, whatever, particularly in comparison to the actual character models. But there's always that slight moment when you then, I don't know, you pick up like a really fancy weapon in the CG cutscene, and then you get it in the game, and it's just like this, you know, rectangular thing. It's like it's just ever so slightly disappointing. And I think like Final Fantasy VII did what? That had like a mix of both, didn't it? It had like the super fancy CG, and then it would also have like other ones with just the character models standing there having a chat with each other. So yeah, I think it's the less, or the fewer times that it kind of jars you out of that, the better. And it speaks to I think some of the art direction and the sound design in particular is incredible in Metal Gear Solid. Like the attention to detail in that. I think there's the scene where you're talking to the DARPA chief in a cell, and Meryl is in the next cell, and it pans over and you see her with her ear against the wall, and it's like slightly muffled, and then it pans back and it's them talking, but it's kind of echoing a bit because of the nature of the facility. You know, there's no soft furnishings in this cell. It's like it's echoing because that's what it would do. And there's just little, again, it's like the attention to detail. I think it's just little things that don't take you out of the game, or they very much keep you in the game, whichever way round. But you often notice it more when something takes you out of the game. So that's kind of why it's kind of phrased in that way. That work really well. I guess and then the combining of, so like the code is on the CD case thing. I mean, that for me is like a bigger thing than BioShock's Would You Kindly. Like that is because it's quite naturally done. You know, like BioShock's Would You Kindly, as clever as that is in game, is a bit like gets hammed up a bit. It gets a bit like, let's spend 10 minutes talking about this, how clever this particular mechanic is. Snake's version of that is, the code that you need is on the CD case, and they've I think set that up well. And I think that's probably okay to say about this, because it's very difficult. It's very unlikely that if you play Metal Gear now, that you're going to play it on a PS1. And if you do play it on a PS1, there is a literal codec frequency that's printed on the back of the CD case in a screenshot. And that's what they're referring to. If you play it now in a more modern way, I'm not sure what
happens is, because I played the PC port last year, I believe what she says is look at the screenshots, and it's the screenshots on GOG include that codec. Right.
Okay, so that, and it's set up, and the way I think that's set up is something I've already kind of talked a little bit about, is that in-game explanation for game mechanics, things like saving the game, or things like, you know, bringing up the codec. You've got the kernel literally talking to you saying, if you need to bring up the codec, press the select button, and then, you know, if the codec beeps, press the select button to answer it. And it's like, okay, I'd much rather that than having a message on the screen in like, you know, like just that doesn't belong in either the game world or in the real world, and it's just there to tell you this bit of information that you need to know that they don't have a better way of conveying. It's like, well, here they've just committed to telling you everything in game, which is which I think works all the better for it. Again, keeps you more in the game.
Well, that's one of the things that adds to, because playing this through, again, like the game doesn't feel old, really. Well, in certain ways it does. No. Of course it does. Like on the technical level, it's old and whatever. But yeah, all those things that you've said, like the CDKs, the sounds, the lack of menus. Apparently, one of the things that Kojima was a great admirer of Final Fantasy VII and the way it did a lot of things, but he didn't like that it used so many menus. I don't know how he expects them to get away from the menus in a game like that, but whatever. He didn't like the menus. And, or at least he didn't like it to the point that he didn't want it in his games. So he uses the codec as a way to kind of get around that. So there's no pause, hit save, go in. I mean, technically there is, because you still open codec, go to mailing, save. But it's all given an in-world reason for you making those actions. So I think that's that like sort of rejection of other extraneous elements that don't relate to what Snake's experience is. The removal of that, one of the things that make it feel still quite modern. And there's other things as well. It's like even though like the enemies are really basic in their patrol patterns, and they kind of got to be, because otherwise the game's going to be way too hard and way too frustrating. But and they're kind of dumb. Like they always just follow the same route. Their vision is, I don't know how you get hired in the army, and you can't. And they're supposed to be genetically modified to like be amazing as well. They can only see about 3 meters. So I don't know how they got that gig, but don't know how that worked, or whoever the decision maker is there might need to have a look in the mirror if they can even see the mirror, because it's so bad eyesight. But they talk to each other. So that just makes them feel like just that tiny bit, that just very simple act of adding these just like pieces of dialogue to each other. And they're not always talking about, like, I can't remember any specific lines, but I don't remember them. They're not only just talking about their life as a guard or go and check over there or whatever. Like they're just talking. There's only 1 or 2 lines, but it's just those little elements that just make the game feel like a world. So it makes it feel like a real place, and you're a real character doing real things. And I think that's how it still feels quite modern and sort of set the tone, really. I mean, it was copied so much, and so many elements of it were taken by other games, not necessarily copied, but used as sort of benchmarks for how to do things. And it's those feelings that it gives you, that emotional response that you have to it through those things, makes it feel still quite modern. And I think you can probably trace back as that being the starting point for a lot of modern norms in gaming that we take for granted.
Yeah, and that's, I think that also ties into the the language the game uses when it's talking about itself as well. So we talked about some of this already, but like the fact that they have these acronyms for things, as dumb as some of them are, and it's like, oh, this is a PAN, and this is a POW, and this is whatever, and it's a personal area network, and they have to spell them all out as well, because nobody knows what they are, who's watching or playing the game. But that is the same thing for me. It feeds into this idea of a real world, because humans love doing nonsense like that. Like when you look at how certain departments, government departments, or even private company departments are named, it's like somebody's worked really hard to make that an acronym, even though that might not be the most efficient way to name that department. So it's like, oh, this is this interacts with your PAN. Oh yeah, your personal area network. And it's like there's a different way of saying that, but that wouldn't create a nice, neat acronym. And so as cheesy as it is for some of those in the game, and they definitely play with it as well and make it, a bit ridiculous. It is just also like, well, yeah, the real world kind of works like that. That is what people do. They are intent on making this nonsense up. So it is that living, breathing world thing. It is. I mean, all of this feeds in hopefully to why the first hour of Metal Gear Solid is amazing. Like what it does for the game, what it does that other games don't do. There's more, of course, far more beyond that first hour as well, that it carries on delivering. It's not like it drops off a cliff after that. So if you haven't played Metal Gear Solid, which lots of people probably haven't, it's quite difficult to play now. You can play it on GOG. There's a bit of fiddly setup with a controller, but it's definitely worth playing, and its sequel, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, right?
Yes, so I mean, we have to wrap up now anyway, because the video that I've recorded is about to end on Ocelot. Yep. So that's all we're allowed to talk about. So yes, we'll be back in 3 episodes time for Metal Gear Solid 2. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Do follow us on social media. We are at Indie by Design, or visit indiebydesign.net, and you can see all the info on the books that we've made and get yourself some copies. Otherwise, see you next week.